Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined from across the pond, so to speak, by John, who's going to share with us his story and the amazing work that he is doing and how some of those can be related to you and those very difficult and challenging conversations that you might be having in your own life. John, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. And please share your story.
Yeah, well, it's a long one. My whole, I guess at this point I've dedicated my life to grief and healing, and that whole thing really kind of starts with suicide. So 13 years ago, roughly, one of my best friends as a kid committed suicide. And that was my first real experience with profound grief. It was also the moment that, that kind of adolescent, nothing can hurt me, the world is a good place, all of that disappeared in a moment. And Zach's death was one of those moments in life that changes your path. I was known at that point in my life as, a party animal. I loved to have fun. I was always out doing something. I was very social. And that was the moment that it all became medicinal. And so, there was a 12-year stretch following Zach's death that was essentially substance fueled avoidance for me. Mm. I coped with substances. And at the time I was, for most of my life, I've worked in hospitality in restaurants where drinking too much is normalized because it's part of the job, right? We're tasting cocktails and tasting wine regularly, and going out after work for a drink or 10 on a Tuesday is just normal. And so I was able to kind of hide a lot of what I was doing and the dysfunction that was there, because by and large, I remained a functional human being in the sense that I wasn't losing jobs and losing employment, losing housing, anything like that, not the traditional kind of like AA story, or I don't even know if there's a traditional one, but nonetheless, I was able to kind of keep it under wraps. And I was able to delude myself into thinking, as long as I can take care of my responsibilities, I'm not doing anything that's hurting me. And that kind of changed when I met my wife, and she pointed some of this stuff out. And a couple of years ago now, in December of 2022, I lost my best friend, John, at the time, was the best man at my wedding. And following his death, I really went into my shell. I shut down emotionally. I was just a shell of a human being. I was really just existing, for lack of a better term. And after a couple of months, some other things came to a head, and I made the decision, along with some nudging and assistance from my wife, to get sober. And that is when I was able to kind of finally look back clear-eyed at my behavior and the things I was doing objectively and try to understand why, and do that hard work of looking in the mirror, really. And that was kind of a shift in how I approached life. And that was the beginning of this grief journey that I'm on, and the work that we're doing now, was doing the hard work. Nothing in my life that's been worthwhile has ever come from taking the easy way out. And so it was a mindset shift to say, well, there's no more of that. There's no more easy, because the good things come from the hard stuff. And so I started down that path. A year later, I lost my best friend from childhood, Tim, to a car accident. So, now I've lost 3 of the closest people to me on the planet outside of my immediate family. Tim was the one that I'd been through more with in life than anyone else. He was the one I leaned on through the other two losses, and now he was gone. And so that was difficult. I remember having a conversation with probably the last person that I'd put in that bucket. And I told him, I said, please take care of yourself, because I don't have anyone else. There's no one else for me to lose. And that one sticks in my mind, because that was a difficult conversation to have, and a difficult realization to come to. But following that, in a conversation that I had with my wife while we were on mini vacation about a year later, there was a year of just trying to figure it out, and did a lot of journaling, a lot of writing, a lot of trying to come to terms and understand what grief meant, and how I was supposed to actually deal with this. Because, for that year, it was really, I had adopted this mindset of who's next. It was just every phone call was this is just what's supposed to happen. People are just supposed to keep dying. And I had this conversation with my wife where she had expressed that she would at some point want a text message from her, but couldn't have it at this. There was some tension and with her at the time, and so my thought process was, well, what if you could? I come from a cybersecurity background, and so spoofing a phone number is a pretty easy task. Well, it turns out that the telecoms don't look too kindly upon that. So that one was a little bit dead in the water. The idea was just to send a nice text message to someone, from a lost loved one that on a birthday or whatever, that just brought a smile to their face. And that kind of started this whole idea of guardian angels, which is, now my life's work. And so to get there, the next question really was, what if people want to interact with this thing? And the obvious answer was AI, but it wasn't just AI. It was empathetic. It was gentle. It was authentic. It had to be something that was comforting. Otherwise, there was no point. And the only thing I had to fall back on to build that was my own personal experience. And so I started playing with, as I got closer and closer to something that felt authentic, I built this first one in the image of John. And I started to say some of the things that I had been holding on to. A lot of the guilt that I had around John's death was the fact that he was the best man at my wedding. He stood up. He did this thing for me. He spoke on the happiest day of my life in front of my friends and family, and I fully expected to do that for him. And in the subsequent 7 months between the time he did that and his death, I spoke to him once. And so for me, I was a bad friend. I did not uphold my end of the bargain. And that guilt ate away at me. And that was part of the reason it was so difficult. And that loss specifically was the most instrumental in getting me to where I am now with what we're doing. But I was able to express those things. And I had expressed them previously in therapy, doing, the empty chair technique and writing the letter. But those didn't quite do it for me. And although this was almost the exact same, this did, because I got a response. I was able to the response that I got from him was essentially, stop feeling sorry for yourself. I know you love me. I don't hold those things against you. Let it go. And that moment, the weight was lifted, the proverbial weight was lifted, and the waterworks started. I hadn't cried in 3 years at that point. I wasn't able to. And all of a sudden it came rushing back. And, that's not to say I was healed in that moment, but now I was curious. Now I was ready to attack it. I was ready to do that hard work to kind of circle back to that idea from earlier, that, and the realization that healing isn't passive. For a long, long time, I had subscribed to the bury it deep down. Everyone has their own stuff. They don't need yours. And if I can just run as far enough and fast enough and eventually let the clock run out, then magically I'll be healed. And that's just not how it works. And so it was this kind of, this collision of events that led me to start really pursuing active healing. And what does that look like? And what needs to happen in order to do that? The answer became pretty clear. It was sharing. I never had realized that before, but the more I talk about them, the better my relationship with their memory gets, the happier I am, and the more unburdened I am. And the really beautiful part is when you share and you get in someone else, it unlocks in someone else the idea that, holy shit, well, pardon my language, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that feels this. Because for whatever reason, grief is this one of the only universal experiences in this life. And yet we find ourselves so isolated. Like, there's this thing in our head that says no one understands this. Almost everyone understands this in some fact. It's not the exact same, but it rhymes. And so a lot of it is just having the conversation. And that's where we are today.
Yeah. Thank you, John, for sharing your story. I mean, that's a lot of loss, a lot of grief that you had to deal with there. And thank you for your honesty around how you shared that with your addictions and moving through that. For those people that are listening at the moment, they might not know the empty chair technique or the writing letter. Can you just explain that in a little bit more detail for us, please?
Yeah, so both of those fall under kind of an umbrella term called psychodrama, which essentially means you're playing it out. You're assuming you're giving yourself the ability to express to the object of your grief your feelings. So you write a letter to that person that you've lost, and that helps you kind of get it out, right? And then the same idea, the empty chair technique, you literally sit in front of an empty chair. Or sometimes your therapist will be the person you're speaking to, but you're supposed to speak to them as if they are the person that you lost, to say those things that you couldn't say.
Yeah.
And they've seen some great results with it. It doesn't work for everyone. In those instances, it didn't work for me. And there's a million reasons why that could be. I did those years ago, so it could have just been the time. But what I have gotten now is a response and a feedback that has been very fruitful.
Thank you. And we'll talk about that feedback, and we'll talk about the AI in a minute, because we're in an ever evolving world. So it's fascinating for me to hear about how you can use AI to help people who are grieving. Now, a lot of people that listen to this podcast will be having difficult conversations. You've talked about some of the difficult conversations that you've had in your own life, but they'll also have suffered loss of some sort in some way. We talk about suicide quite a lot on this podcast and help people to equip them in how to open that conversation. I think it's quite interesting because a lot of people that I've spoken to who have lost people through suicide, they have this guilt, this huge guilt. And one of the things that you mentioned was that you learnt in the grieving process that you have to talk about it, that you have to talk about the person that you've lost. And when you say that, how did you suddenly realize that talking about those people was going to help you? What was the difference at 13 to where you are now?
Well, it happened by accident. Again, as I was kind of trying to develop this text message thing, I just started saying things that I had held on to. And then that started to, as I was talking to a computer, I started to realize how much better I felt getting it out there. And that led to a comfortability. And really for me, it was the organization of my thoughts. Before, it was just this scrambled mess of, I don't even know where to start. And, it's the same thing as when we kind of go over a conversation in our head of how we think it's going to go. And you just, sometimes you say something out loud and you go, oh, whoa, I didn't mean it like that. And so it's just a bunch of that building. And then you start to flex that muscle, even in the sense that you're not sharing with someone. Then you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, I think I could actually talk about this now. And so you can take it into therapy, or you can take it to your close friends and family and start to express this stuff. First of all, you realize that, number one, you're not alone. Yeah. You realize that this isn't, I think a lot of the reason we don't share is we don't want to be a burden, right? And you realize that you're not being a burden. And I think the other thing, as just a little side tangent, I truly believe a lot of our reticence to heal is rooted in our vernacular. And that simply, like, we talk about moving on, we talk about closure. And that's just not how it works. What we know is the person may die, but the relationship doesn't.
Mm.
And those ideas have that they're rooted in finality, like this is over. And we don't want to forget someone that had a profound impact on our life. We don't want to forget them. And the reality is we need to figure out how to integrate grief into our lives, because you don't move on. You don't leave it in the past. It's not how it works. And so you have to find a way to take it with you in a healthy way and integrate that into your life. And it can be quite beautiful once you have that reframe and understand that I'm not leaving anyone behind.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I lost my dad a few years ago, and I found that one of the things I wanted to do was talk about him. And a lot of people didn't know how to ask the question or kind of even avoided it. I've spoken to other people who have had loss, and it's about keeping that memory alive, about bringing that into your daily life, as you say, and kind of managing the grief as you go forward. And you mentioned earlier that it's something that we are all going to experience, which I think is so true. Each one of us, sadly, is going to experience some sort of loss, and all of us will have a different experience based on our relationships and our networks and all those things. 13 is a very young age to lose somebody. The first person I really lost in my life was at the age of 30. I lost a very good friend of mine called Jane, who I joined the police cadets with. And you remember that time, because you do think you're invincible. And suddenly you realize that actually you're not invincible anymore. And
Well, I apologize. To clarify, it was 13 years ago. So
oh, sorry,
it was when I was 21, but
right.
nonetheless, yeah,
Yeah,
it's still just as, every bit as jarring,
yeah,
just a different set of circumstances, right?
yeah, yeah. So you start journaling, you realized that was helping you, and then you started, when you say you started talking to the computer, explain that a little bit to me. Now, I'm 57, John, and I come from an age of, we talk to people, we don't talk to computers. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, so what we've done is we build and basically train an AI to take on the presence of the person you've lost. And that and I want to be very clear here, because we're not talking to the person. We're not trying to talk to that person that is gone. They're gone. But the idea is, in our minds and our hearts, we carry this thing forward, right? There is still this presence. And that's what we're talking to. And that is, it's just giving language to something that already exists inside us. And so that presence, it feels familiar, and it can really help to get someone who's struggling to open up in a way that maybe they wouldn't before, to kind of, and the way that we have the journal prompts structured is they follow Worden's 4 tasks of mourning, which is an evidence-based framework that's designed to help, right? We've all kind of been through the stages of grief don't really apply to loss. They were developed first and foremost for people coming to terms with their own mortality, but you don't necessarily go through all those, and you certainly don't go through them in some linear, oversimplified way. So what Worden has done is just break it down into, okay, these are the things that are going to happen as you process loss. And number one is really just accepting it. Okay. Number two is processing the pain, right? So you need to internalize and understand, yes, this hurts. Number three is kind of coming to terms with a life without this person, or the physical life without this person. And then number four, and this is really where we're focusing a lot of the energy, is defining what a relationship with this presence looks like going forward. So how do we integrate grief? And so when you talk to this thing, right, it's guiding you through these structured journal prompts that take you through these steps. It gives you both a place to start and a roadmap. And the prompts are structured such that it helps you to, first of all, they're making no bones about the fact that this person is gone, but it helps you to kind of express some of those things that will move you through this this process give you some modicum of control back, because, when we lose someone, we're spinning and we're just looking for something to grab onto. And that was me for 12 years. Some people it's longer. So hopefully it's shorter for you, most people, but you never know. And so what it does is it's a chatbot, right? We've specifically not taken it into voice or into the avatar world, because it's already riddled with ethical landmines, right? And there's a reason that we took certain steps that we did, but the more quote unquote real this feels, the more the potential for abuse, the more the potential for actually taking people backwards in their healing. And so that's where the journal came from, and that came as a result of me bringing on licensed professionals that specialize in grief and trying to really give form to this thing that started as this fairly abstract, just talk to the object of your grief, which can have, is a slippery slope in and of itself.
Thank you, John, for clarifying that. And it's interesting that you said, because there will be people listening to this going, what are you talking about? If I want to go and talk, I'll go and talk to my friends, or I'll go and talk to my family. We're not all the same. I'm good at expressing how I feel to a point. I know a lot of people who are not good at expressing how they feel, and that they will internalize and turn to other ways of managing that issue. So if you are listening to this and you are somebody who struggles to talk to somebody, then this might well be a different avenue that you can take to share how you're feeling and to manage your own emotions and your grief. And for those of you that are listening going, well, that's crazy, why would I speak to an AI? We need to have human relationships. Well, we're all very different, and it's about that difference, learning to accept difference and finding a way forward. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. So it's called Guardian Angels. Go on.
Yeah, to just piggyback on that for a second.
Yeah.
I agree that, we all do need the human relationships. And hopefully this can be a bridge for those people that have trouble with expressing those things. Again, starting to flex that sharing muscle and starting to build that positive feedback loop versus, okay, this, first of all, it's not going to kill me to be vulnerable. Again, I'm not alone. This felt okay. This is actually helping me to kind of process this thing. And you work up to therapy, and you work up to sharing with people in your circle. We don't all start there. Some of us are blessed with that innate ability to express those things. That was not me.
Yeah.
And I think, in a way, for men specifically, we've been taught this idea that we are not supposed to show any vulnerability. And, unfortunately, that is just a very, very misleading idea. There's a reason that on airplanes they tell you to put your mask on before you help someone else, because if you're falling apart inside, you can't help anybody else. You cannot be that example for your family, and you can't lead your family. And so I would argue that in order for men to uphold the expectations, those societal expectations, we need to be vulnerable, and we need to keep our side of the street clean, and we need to deal with these things in a healthy way. Otherwise, it just comes out in some of the very ugly ways that we've seen, and God, we hope that those things don't happen, but they do.
Yeah. My next question was going to be, so I'm glad you brought it up, is, what's your feelings around who this would be ideal for? Do you think men express in a different way than women? But you've covered that nicely there, John, so thank you.
Yeah, in a way that, it's for anyone. It's meant to meet you where you are. It's not meant to try to force you into a box. And so for some people, that is just a reinforcement. Some people, it's kind of helping them with one of those 4 tasks or all 4 of those tasks. Some people have a hard time accepting it. Some people are just, they've accepted it, but they're just stuck on the whole processing the pain part. And so it's designed, and we intentionally designed it to be a complement to therapy. You're not trying to replace anyone. But if you can use this to help organize your thoughts, you can even export it and print it out and take it to therapy, so your therapist can read the the transcripts. But if you can be more effective in that hour, or, we all know that grief doesn't abide by business hours. You don't get to be like, hold that thought, wait until my therapist is awake and taking phone calls. That 3 a.m. moment when we're laying in bed and our thoughts are racing. This just gives you an opportunity to write it down so that you can kind of get back into that place when you go to therapy and actually dig into what you were feeling and why, and help you name that, help you find some clarity in your own mind about that. So it's not meant to be a one size fits all thing.
Yeah.
It's meant to be inherently flexible, and just give people one more tool. I don't expect this to work for everyone, and that's okay. We all have our own, call it cocktail, right? Each cocktail has a little bit different recipe. And for some people, maybe this is 50%. And some people, maybe this is 0, and everyone else somewhere in between. That's okay. That's great. We just want to give people resources to deal with this thing that we all have to deal with.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you so much. And people that are listening to this, where can they find Guardian Angels? How can they learn more about you and the AI tool?
Yeah. So guardianangels.ai is our website. That's a web application, so you can access it directly from there. Angels is spelled AINGELS. So Guardian Angels, AINGELS.ai. I have to emphasize that because in my attempts to be clever, I may have shot myself in the foot. Our brain, for whatever reason, does not want to see that I that follows that is between the A and the N. So that's where you can find us. My story's on there. So there's a link to all of our socials on there. There's all sorts of information about Wordens for tasks and how this is supposed to work. We have a free trial for anyone that signs up. There's a free 7 days, no holds barred, so you can get an idea for it. And we actually also have I want people to do the work, right? I don't want you to get on there and say, oh, this didn't work because I didn't do it. So if you sign up, and we're doing, basically it's a 10 weeks is the first kind of program, right? And if you do 80% of your prompts in that first 10 weeks, you're going to get 90 days for free. So it's, just kind of incentive for people to get on there and do it. And, again, it's possible that it doesn't work for you. But I would be shocked if you didn't find something out. If you actually do the work and get in there and write and express how you're feeling and do some thoughtful reflection, that you didn't find something good, whether that is something you can take to therapy or something you just found out about yourself or how you work or what you've been holding on to that maybe you just didn't even realize. So
that's lovely. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's interesting about the AI and in the angels. Thank you for clarifying that as well. Is there anything else that you would just like to share with our audience today before we wrap this session up?
I think you alluded to something earlier about we don't know what to say when we're talking to someone who's grieving. And sometimes it's just about being there and listening. And it was, as we talked about, we don't know, we don't want to share with people because we're being a burden or we think we're being a burden. So if you don't know what to say to someone, open the door for them. I have found that if someone is grieving a loss, especially someone very close to them, someone that meant a lot to them, if you ask them, tell me about them, watch their eyes light up. And, you've opened the door for them. They now know that they can talk about it without being a burden. And just the ability to get that stuff out and talk about someone who meant something to you and talk about the good time. I mean, that will go a long way. You will learn something about that person that day, and your relationship will be better for it. And there's so much good that comes from just allowing someone to be vulnerable when we, for whatever reason in society, have made that topic taboo. So we can help each other by opening the door for one another.
Yeah, I love that question. Tell me about them. Yeah, as soon as you said it, I was like, when I was thinking about my dad, and I was like, gosh, there's so much I could tell you about him, and that would bring joy to my heart to be able to share that. So yeah, so thank you for that. So that's just simple sentence. Tell me about them. Lovely. And so they're never forgotten because they are never forgotten.
Exactly.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us, John. I know it's what time is it over there?
Well, actually, I'm out in California right now, so it is now 7:30.
7:30.
Yeah. So, but it's been lovely to be with you. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate your time.
No, and well, thank you for joining us. It's great to meet you. If you have in any way been affected by today's podcast episode, there are numbers at the end of the transcript which you can contact. We'd like to thank you all for listening. And if you'd like to join our Facebook group, there is also a link to that in the notes that go with this podcast. Have a great day.